East African civilization is composed of three main nations, Nubia, Egypt, and Ethiopia. The people of Nubia referred to their land as Kush and identified as Kushites. Nubia means land of the gold. It is one of the oldest civilizations that exists in Africa. It predates Egypt. Egypt, in northern Africa, was the cradle of civilization. Many of the inventions and ideas from Egypt were used in Greece to help build modern civilization. The people who lived in Egypt called it Kemet or Black Land. Ethiopia means burnt skin, and is the only ancient African civilization that was not conquered. Haile Selassie, an emperor of Ethiopia, was believed to be descended from the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Rastafarianism stemmed from Haile Selassie and his royal biblical ties. There is some evidence for early Ethiopian expeditions. In central Mexico, in the Olmec civilizations, there have been several colossal stone heads found. These statues have African features such as big lips, a flat nose, and wearing African headdress. In Ethiopia, the same stone heads have been found, suggesting that at some point in ancient civilization, Ethiopians traveled across the Atlantic to Mexico. Ghana and Mali played a large role in West African civilization. Ghana is the oldest civilization in West Africa. By 300 AD, there had been 44 kings in Ghana. This West African civilization is closely associated with war and gold. Fortunately, the majority of ancient Ghana is still intact, which allows for archaeological digs and educational study of the region. Mali was a Muslim empire. Its capital was Timbuktu. Mali had a plethora of gold within its nation. It was a symbol of beauty rather than a measure of wealth. This nation had an established education system based on religion, known as the University of Sankore, which offered higher education during a time when education was not valued. King Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim and went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. On his journey, he stopped and stayed in various parts of Africa. He brought with him 12 tons of gold that he handed out on his way. News of his wealth began to spread, and when people asked where it had come from, they answered all the way in Timbuktu. This popular saying is still used in modern language. The Moorish Empire, modern-day Morocco, is located in North Africa. The Moorish Empire conquered Spain and Portugal for 700 years from 711 AD to 1492 AD. Before being conquered by the Moors, Spain and Portugal were still in the Dark Ages. There was no bathing or self-care, and education was thought to be blasphemous. The Moors brought them out of the Dark Ages, building universities and educating the general public. The Moors were expelled from Spain and Portugal after the union of Ferdinand and Isabella. The combined military and financial strength allowed for them to take back their kingdom from the Moors. In Portugal in 1415, Prince Henry the Navigator decided to send several expeditions to Africa. His curiosity was initially sparked by hearing about Timbuktu. He had grown up being told about tales of this city where the streets were paved with gold. On these expeditions to Africa, he requested that plants, animals, and people be brought back to Portugal for him to study and learn more about this far-off land. Prince Henry would observe and study the people brought back to him, and once he had finished with them, there was the question of what to do with these people. These people began to be placed in wealthy people's homes as domestic servants. It became a new sign of status and wealth. Prince Henry invented the slave trade. It was created as a byproduct from his explorations. The transatlantic slave trade, also known as the triangular trade, began in the 1500s. The three major points in this route were Europe, Africa, and the New World. An estimated 10 to 15 million Africans were taken from their homes to be sold. The majority of Africans ended up in colonies in South and Central America, as well as the Caribbean islands. Less than 1 million slaves came to the United States. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade, slavery was not a permanent condition. It was a person selling their labor in order to gain something. Chattel slavery is a result of the European slave trade, which was based on the color of someone's skin, and forced people into slavery. The word chattel means property, and it was used to dehumanize Africans. Chattel slavery in the United States lasts from 1619 to 1865. During this time period, it was believed that Africans were not human. Charles Darwin's scientific theory disproved this statement. Darwin had proved that different species are unable to procreate, and members of the same species are able to. Africans and Europeans were able to reproduce, therefore they had to be the same species. It was then stated that Europeans were the most evolved species and that Africans were behind them in the evolutionary stages. In an effort to belittle African slaves, white slave owners separated families, banned singing, and attempted to erase any African culture. In modern day, it is nearly impossible for an African American to trace their lineage back to their ancestors, because there were no records kept, and any that were destroyed. Children were taken from their families. The goal of dehumanizing slaves was to make them feel like there was nowhere to escape to, and they had no home. Once the African slaves were taken from their homes, they were taken to British colonies, which included Bermuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad, as well as the New World. The Jim Crow era began in 1877 after Reconstruction ended. Because of the unfair treatment and racial segregation brought about by the Jim Crow era, many African Americans wanted to move from the South to other parts of the country in order to find a better life. The Great Migration occurred in two waves. The first wave occurred in 1877. An overwhelming percentage of blacks lived in the South after the end of Reconstruction, 80 to 90% of them. The first wave of the Great Migration, many blacks did not want to go north because of the Great Betrayal. They went out west. A small percentage of them went and were not very integrated into the West, but things were better than they had been in the South. Following the first wave of the Great Migration, which began in 1877 and ended in 1896, the second wave of the Great Migration began. This was the largest migration of any group in a nation-state. This migration of African Americans began in the Southeast, and they migrated to the Midwest and Northeast in search for jobs. This was a move from rural to urban areas. During this time, European immigrants were also streaming into the United States, increasing the level of competitiveness for jobs. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in 1909 by W.E.B. Du Bois. The focus of the NAACP is to obtain equality and integration for all people of color. Du Bois believed that the most effective way to accomplish this goal of equality was by focusing on a liberal arts education for the talented 10th, or the top 10% of black intellect. He believed that by working together as a community and advancing the most intelligent young blacks, once these elites have acquired success and power, they will come back and help improve the black community. The Universal Negro Improvement Association was founded in the early 1900s by Marcus Garvey. This organization helped promote a sense of black nationalism. Black nationalism stemmed from Marcus Garvey's philosophy that the black community should focus on its needs and individuals should embrace their heritage and be proud of who they are. UNIA initially had chapters primarily along the East Coast, which were started by Garvey during his travels. To create a tangible sense of community, the UNIA had uniforms and identification cards for their members. This organization allowed for economic growth among black communities. The UNIA restored old factories and produced military weapons, along with the creation of a luxury steamship line. The UNIA successfully created a fluent economy in many black communities and a sense of self-pride. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded as a result of the Montgomery bus boycott on the basis of nonviolent integration and transportation. Members of this group collectively wrote the infamous speech, "I Have a Dream," given by Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The Congress of Racial Equality was founded in 1942 and is known as one of the leading activist groups during the Civil Rights Movement. It is an interfaith group of religious leaders as well as an interracial organization. Responsible for the Freedom Ride protests in 1961, which tested desegregation in the interstate bus travel. This forced the federal government to make a public stand for what they supported. This protest was dangerous for the participants and resulted in bombs being thrown at the bus and people being dragged out of the vehicle and beaten.
I think this is a very relevant topic to be learning about in today's world. People don't realize how recently some of these events occurred. I was really shocked to learn about the little girls who were killed at the Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. I live there, so it really hit home for me. I had really never been able to take an African American studies class, and this was a very enlightening conversation about African American history. I think the rich culture that Africa has is oftentimes overlooked because of our Eurocentric educational system. I really liked the format of the website. It was well organized and allowed me to navigate through African American history. It opened my eyes to the privilege I have as a white male in the South.